The heavy industrial mop clattered to the marble floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the silent corridor. Bunmi's breath hitched, her lungs suddenly too small for the air in the room. There he was, Choi Young, the man who had haunted her dreams and her nightmares for 12 long months, standing less than 10 feet away. He looked exactly as she remembered, sharp, lethal, and draped in a suit that cost more than she would earn in a decade. But as his cold, predatory gaze dropped from her face to the heavy 8-month curve of her belly beneath her stained cleaning tunic, the king of Seoul went deathly pale. Bunmi's yellow rubber gloves felt slick with sweat as she gripped the handle of her bucket. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, the price of an 8-hour shift on her feet. The corporate hallways of this skyscraper smelled of lemon bleach and expensive floor wax, a sterile world away from the penthouse she once called home. "Take a break, Bunmi," the older janitor, Mrs. Hwan, had whispered earlier, her eyes softening at the sight of Bunmi's swollen ankles. "The baby needs you to rest." "I'm fine," Bunmi had lied, the same lie she told herself every morning when she woke up on a cot in a basement apartment. The baby kicked, a sharp, rolling movement against her ribs, as if sensing the danger nearby. She hadn't eaten since a sleeve of saltines at dawn. Tips from the office workers were non-existent. To them, she was just a ghost in a beige uniform. A year ago, she had been draped in silk, waking up to the smell of expensive coffee and the warmth of Young's arms. Now she was hiding in plain sight, scrubbing the dirt off the shoes of men like him. She had stayed hidden to save his life. She had stayed hidden because she thought he'd replaced her. But as Young's eyes locked onto hers, the icy mask of the Mafia boss shattered, revealing a raw, agonizing hunger that told her one thing: he had never stopped looking. The hallway felt like a tunnel closing in, the fluorescent lights overhead humming with a sudden, deafening intensity. As Bunmi stood there, a ghost in a beige tunic, her mind fractured, spiraling back through the blurred, grueling months of her disappearance. For a year, she had mastered the art of being invisible. She had traded her name for a series of aliases, and her designer heels for cheap, rubber-soled shoes that squeaked on linoleum. To the world, she was just another body moving through the city's underbelly, a shadow cleaning the glass of buildings she used to own. The transition from a queen to a fugitive hadn't been a choice, it had been a survival instinct. She remembered the cold, clinical look on the lieutenant's face when he showed her the forged documents, Young's signature on a marriage contract with a political heiress, and the intercepted hit order on her life. "You are his weakness, Bunmi," the traitor had whispered. "If you stay, he burns. If you leave, he lives." So she had vanished. Her life became a ledger of survival. Mornings were spent scrubbing the grease-stained counters of a 24-hour diner in Incheon. Afternoons were dedicated to folding laundry in a windowless basement, and nights ended here, at this corporate tower, mopping the floors of men who never looked her in the eye. Every won she earned was tucked into a hollowed-out book, a desperate fund for the prenatal vitamins and the midwife who didn't ask for identification. The physical toll was a constant gnawing presence. Her back felt like it was being compressed by lead, and her feet were so swollen that peeling off her socks at night was an exercise in suppressed tears. There were nights she had collapsed on her thin mattress, her stomach cramping from hunger because she'd skipped dinner to ensure she had enough for the baby's next checkup. She had convinced herself that Young was happy. She had imagined him in a grand ballroom, a different woman on his arm, his lethal heart finally stilled by a proper wife. That lie was the only thing that kept the heartbreak from swallowing her whole. But looking at him now, seeing the way his hands trembled as he stared at her belly, the lie disintegrated. The man standing before her didn't look like a groom who had moved on. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by grief,
a king who had searched every corner of hell and had finally found what he was looking for in a cleaning closet. The baby shifted, a heavy, restless weight against her spine, and Bunmi realized with a jolt of terror that her year of hiding was over. The ghost had been caught.
The silence in the hallway wasn't empty. It was a physical weight, thick with the scent of floor wax and the sudden, sharp ozone of Young's presence. Behind him, his two lieutenants froze like statues, their shadows stretching long and jagged against the polished tile. They knew better than to breathe. They knew the look on Choi Young's face, the look of a man who had finally found the person he had burned half of Seoul to find. Bunmi felt the cold air of the vents hit the back of her neck, but her skin was burning. She wanted to run, to melt back into the shadows of the service stairwell, but her legs were anchored by the sheer gravity of his gaze. Every beat of her heart felt like a hammer against her ribs, echoing the frantic, rhythmic pulsing of the life growing inside her. Young took a single step forward, the click of his Italian leather shoes sounding like a gavel in the stillness. His eyes, usually as unreadable as obsidian, were wide, tracing the contours of her face with a desperate, starving intensity. He looked for the girl who had disappeared in a cloud of silk and perfume, but he found a woman tempered by the grit of the streets. His gaze snagged on the raw redness of her hands, the stray curl escaping her tight bun, and finally, the undeniable heavy swell of her stomach beneath the cheap polyester of her uniform. "Bunmi," he whispered. The name sounded foreign coming from him now, stripped of its usual authority and replaced by a jagged, breaking edge of grief. It was a plea, a question, and a confession all at once. She flinched at the sound, her fingers curling into the fabric of her apron. The memory of the forged marriage papers flashed in her mind, the image of him at an altar with another woman. She waited for the anger to come, for the self-preservation to kick in, but all she felt was a soul-deep exhaustion. The world around them, the billion-dollar merger he was here to sign, the corporate empire he was poised to seize, simply ceased to exist. There was only the hum of the lights and the two of them, separated by a year of lies and 10 feet of cold marble. Young's hand reached out, trembling mid-air as if he were afraid she would dissolve into smoke if he touched her. The terrifying silence stretched, taut as a wire about to snap, until the baby kicked, a sharp, visible movement that rippled across the front of her tunic. Young's breath hitched, a choked sound escaping his throat. In that moment, the king of fear didn't look like a king at all. He looked like a man who had just realized he had been mourning a living heart. The air between them fractured as Young took another step, his presence overwhelming the narrow corridor. He didn't look at his men. He didn't look at the boardroom doors. His entire universe had narrowed down to the woman trembling in front of him and the life moving beneath her palms. He reached out, his gloved fingers hovering just inches from the rough fabric of her uniform before he hesitated, as if his touch might bruise her. "How long?" he asked, his voice a jagged rasp. It wasn't the voice of a man who commanded legions, it was the voice of a man standing at the edge of a ruin. Bunmi swallowed hard, her throat tight with a year's worth of swallowed tears. She couldn't meet his eyes, focusing instead on the dragon tattoo peeking out from his collar, a symbol of the power that had once protected her, and then, she believed, betrayed her. 8 months, she whispered, nearly 9. The silence that followed was more violent than any shout. Young's hand finally dropped, his fingers curling into a white-knuckled fist at his side. The math was a physical blow to his chest. 8 months. He had spent those 8 months in a cold, murderous fury, tearing apart the city's foundations, convinced she had been snatched away or killed. While he was sleeping in a bed that felt like a tomb, she had been waking up in the dark to scrub floors. While he was counting enemies, she was counting weeks. He looked at her feet,
the cheap, worn-out shoes that offered no support for a woman carrying his heir. He looked at the thinness of her wrists and the exhaustion etched into the hollows of her cheeks. He had missed the first flutter of movement. He had missed the scans, the cravings, the quiet nights of watching her sleep while their child grew. He had missed the entire transformation of the woman he loved into the mother of his child, and the realization was a blade twisting in his gut. "You were here," he murmured, his eyes darkening with a terrifying mix of grief and burgeoning rage. "You were in this city, working like this, while I lived in a palace built on your absence." Bunmi finally looked up, her gaze flickering with the remnants of the fear that had sent her running. "I thought you didn't want us, Young. I thought I was protecting you from a scandal." His brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing his pale features before the cold clarity of a boss took over. Someone had done this. Someone had fed her a lie so poisonously perfect that she had chosen a basement over a throne. His gaze softened as it returned to her stomach, and for a fleeting second, the ruthless king of Seoul looked utterly broken. He had found her, but the weight of everything he had lost was a debt he didn't know how to pay.
The transition from the cold, sterile hallway to the plush interior of Young's armored car happened in a blur of motion and stifled commands. He didn't let her walk. He had swept her into his arms as if she were made of glass, ignoring her quiet protests and the stunned stares of the corporate executives. Now they were in the private medical wing of his estate, a place of white marble and cutting-edge technology that felt like another planet compared to the basement clinics Bunmi had frequented. A team of doctors moved with silent, terrified efficiency, checking the baby's heartbeat while Young stood by the window, his back a rigid line of tension. Only when the lead physician gave a sharp, reassuring nod did the air finally leave Young's lungs. He turned, his gaze dropping to the small, tattered envelope Bunmi had clutched in her hands throughout the drive. "Show me," he commanded, though his voice lacked its usual bite. With trembling fingers, Bunmi handed him the forged marriage contract and the intercepted execution order that had sent her into the shadows. Young smoothed the paper on the mahogany desk, his eyes scanning the elegant script and the official seal of the Choi family. For a long moment, he was silent. Then a low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a laugh that held no mirth, only a terrifying, cold fury. He traced the signature at the bottom, his thumb hovering over the ink. "My father's seal," he murmured, the words dripping with ice. "And my lieutenant's handwriting." The web began to unravel before him. The political marriage had been a fiction designed to make Bunmi feel like an obstacle. The execution order was a ghost story meant to drive her into a corner where she could be easily erased. They hadn't just stolen a year of his life, they'd tried to bury his legacy before it was even born. He looked at Bunmi, who was sitting on the edge of the examination bed, her oversized uniform looking even more tragic against the silk sheets. She looked like a survivor of a war he hadn't known he was fighting. "I never signed this," he said, his voice dropping to a low, fierce vow. He stepped toward her, kneeling so he was at eye level with her and the child she carried. "I have spent 12 months burning this city to find the person who took you. I didn't realize the monster was sitting at my own table." He reached out, finally allowing his hand to rest gently over the curve of her stomach. The baby kicked against his palm, a steady, defiant thrum of life. Young's eyes closed, the mask of the boss slipping for a heartbeat to reveal the shattered man beneath. The hunt was over, but the war, the one that would purge his own bloodline to protect hers, had only just begun. The steady, rhythmic beep of the fetal monitor was the only heartbeat in the silent medical suite, a clinical lullaby that finally lulled Bunmi into a heavy, exhausted sleep. The harsh glow of the emergency lights had been dimmed to a soft amber, casting long shadows across the silk sheets that looked far too white against her tanned, scrub-worn skin. Young didn't retreat to his study. He didn't call his generals to map out the coming slaughter. Instead, he pulled a stiff leather chair to the side of her bed and sat. His broad shoulders hunched as he watched the rise and fall of her chest. For the first time in a year, the restless, violent energy that usually drove him was replaced by a hollow, aching stillness. As the hours crawled toward dawn, his head finally dropped, sleep claiming him in fits and starts. He didn't dream of his empire or his enemies. He dreamt of the basement apartment Bunmi had described, the smell of damp concrete and the thin mattress where his heir had spent 8 months in the dark. He woke with a start when Bunmi shifted in her sleep, her hand instinctively curling over her stomach. Yang reached out, his large, scarred hand covering hers, feeling the warmth of her skin. It was a grounding heat, a stark contrast to the cold, gold-plated life he had been living. In the quiet of the 3 a.m. shadows, the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had spent his life building a fortress of fear, thinking that power was his only protection. But as he looked at the woman who had survived a year of poverty just to keep their child safe, he realized he had been living in a graveyard. The throne his father protected was nothing but a pile of cold stones. This quiet room, the soft sound of her breathing, the tiny, defiant kick of the life beneath his palm was his only true territory. He had nearly lost his home forever. Not a house, not a penthouse overlooking the Han River, but the only person who had ever seen the man behind the monster. He leaned his forehead against the edge of the mattress, his eyes burning with a rare, stinging moisture. He had been a king of ashes, but as the first light of morning touched the window, he made a silent vow to the woman sleeping before him. He would not just find the traitors, he would dismantle the very world that had made her feel she had to run. The king of Seoul was gone. In his place was a man who realized that his greatest strength wasn't the blood on his hands, but the family he was finally holding on to.
The heavy oak doors of the medical suite swung open with a sharp, entitled click, cutting through the fragile peace Young had cultivated. It wasn't the soft tread of a nurse, but the rhythmic, aggressive strike of designer stilettos. Bunmi stirred, her eyes fluttering open just as a woman draped in charcoal silk and smelling of expensive, suffocating lilies stepped into the light. This was Park Se-yoon, the woman from the forged documents, the fiancée. Se-yoon didn't look at Young first. Her gaze, cold and surgical, raked over Bunmi, lingering on the hospital gown and the way her rough, calloused hand rested against the pristine white sheets. A thin, mocking smile touched her lips. "So, the little stray finally crawled back to the palace?" Bunmi purred, her voice a sharp contrast to the quiet hum of the monitors. She stepped closer to the bed, ignoring the way Young's shadow darkened beside her. "I must admit, the disheveled cleaner look is a bold choice for the mother of a Choi heir, or is it just a performance to garner sympathy?" Bunmi pulled the sheets higher, her heart hammering. The fear that had lived in her marrow for a year flared back to life. "I didn't crawl back," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Oh, please," Se-yoon waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Do you truly think a year in a basement changes the reality of this world? Your reappearance is a technicality, Bunmi, a messy one." She leaned over the railing, her eyes flashing with a venomous delight. "The merger between our families is signed in blood and billions. Your husband is bound to me by the patriarch's own hand. His father hasn't just planned a wedding, he's planned a transition, one that doesn't include a ghost from the slums and a child that disrupts the ledger." Young moved then, a slow, predatory shift that should have silenced the room, but Se-yoon didn't flinch. She turned to Young, her smile widening. "Don't look at me like that, Young. Your father sent me to remind you that a king doesn't choose his heart, he chooses his borders. He's already given the order. If you don't cast this girl back into the shadows where she belongs, he'll ensure she stays there, permanently. And this time, no one will be looking for a body. The room went deathly cold. Bunmi looked at Young, the old terror clawing at her throat. The lie she had lived was becoming a reality. Her presence wasn't just a scandal, it was a target painted on his back. As Se-yoon turned on her heel, a scent of lilies lingering like a funeral shroud, the weight of the patriarch's threat hung in the air. A promise that the war for their family was no longer a shadow game, but a race against a clock they were already losing.
The hospital room felt smaller now, the walls closing in with the suffocating scent of lilies and the lingering echoes of Se-yoon's threats. Bunmi sat up, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. The old, familiar instinct, the one that had kept her alive in basement apartments and windowless tuchins, screamed at her to move. If she stayed, Yang would lose his empire. If she stayed, the patriarch would ensure their child never drew a first breath. She waited until the hallway went silent, until the heavy thud of Yang's footsteps receded toward his study to deal with the fallout of the merger. With trembling hands, she pulled a worn cardigan over her gown and stepped into her old, rubber-soled shoes. Each step toward the service exit was a knife in her lower back, her body protesting the weight of the 8-month life she carried. She reached the heavy metal door of the laundry loading dock, the cold night air hitting her face like a slap. But as she stepped into the shadows, a hand, small, wrinkled, and surprisingly strong, caught her wrist. "Going somewhere, little bird?" Bunmi froze. It was Mrs. Wan, the head of the estate's domestic staff, a woman who had seen 3 generations of Choi men rise and fall. She stood there with a thermos of tea and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 storms. "I have to go," Bunmi whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm a target. As long as I'm here, he has a weakness. His father will kill us both just to keep his throne." Mrs. Wan didn't let go. Instead, she stepped closer, her face softening into a mask of stern compassion. "You think running is protection? You ran for a year, and look at your hands, child. Look at your tired eyes. You didn't protect him. You just let the monsters rewrite his soul. He spent a year becoming a ghost because you were one." "He'll lose everything," Bunmi sobbed. "A throne is just a chair if there's no one to sit beside it," the older woman countered, her voice dropping to a fierce, low rumble. "You aren't a weakness, Bunmi. You are the only thing that makes him human. If you run now, you aren't saving him, you're surrendering him to the darkness he finally escaped." She placed a hand over Bunmi's stomach, feeling the restless stir of the baby. "This child doesn't need a fugitive for a mother. He needs a queen who is brave enough to stand her ground. You've spent a year scrubbing the dirt off other people's floors. It's time you stopped acting like you belong beneath their feet." Bunmi looked back at the towering fortress of the estate, then down at the dark, empty road ahead. The fear was still there, sharp and cold, but beneath it a spark of something hotter began to flicker. For the first time in a year, she didn't want to hide, she wanted to fight. Turning away from the exit, she leaned into Mrs. Wan's shoulder, her resolve hardening like tempered steel. She wasn't going back to the basement. The heavy, gilded doors of the Grand Council chamber didn't just open, they groaned under the weight of history as they were thrown wide. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged scotch and the cold, sterile arrogance of the Choi patriarch. Around the mahogany table sat the men who pulled the strings of the city, their faces etched with the expectation of a surrender. But as Choi Young stepped into the light, the room went deathly silent. He wasn't alone. Bunmi walked beside him, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of his arm.
She was no longer wearing the stained polyester of a cleaner or the hospital gown of a victim. She wore a dress of deep midnight velvet that draped over the proud 8-month curve of her belly. Her head was held high, her gaze steady, a queen returning to a court that had tried to bury her. "What is this insolence?" the patriarch barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "You bring a servant into this sacred hall? The merger is being finalized, Young. Remove her, or I will have the guards do it for you." Young didn't flinch. He walked to the head of the table, pulling out a chair for Bunmi with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. Only when she was seated did he turn to face the room, his eyes like twin shards of black ice. "This servant is my wife," Young said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that made the crystal glasses on the table chatter. "And the child she carries is the only legacy I recognize. You spoke of a merger, of borders, and of blood, but you forgot one thing." He leaned over the table, his hands flat on the polished wood. "If this empire requires me to choose between my crown and my family, then I will burn every building, every bank, and every bridge you have ever built. I will leave you sitting on a throne of ash before I let you touch them again." The silence that followed was absolute. The King of Fear had found a power greater than violence, and for the first time in his life, the patriarch looked small. Young reached out and took Bunmi's hand, his thumb stroking the rough skin of her knuckles, a reminder of the year she had spent in the dark. "The merger is dead," Young declared, his gaze sweeping the room, "and so is the old way of doing things. We are leaving. Try to stop us and see how brightly this city can burn."
The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a home that no longer felt like a fortress. Gone were the armed guards at every inner door and the oppressive, silent tension of a man waiting for a war. In their place was the soft, rhythmic creak of a rocking chair and the distant, melodic hum of a lullaby. Young sat on the edge of the bed, his silk tie discarded on the floor, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dragon tattoo that had once terrified the streets of Seoul. But the hands that had commanded a criminal empire were now cradling something infinitely more fragile. A 3-month-old boy with Bunmi's wide, curious eyes and Young's stubborn chin blinked up at him, a tiny fist curling around his father's thumb. The transition hadn't been a single moment, but 1,000 quiet surrenders. The King of Fear had dismantled the machinery of his father's legacy piece by piece, trading the shadows of the underworld for legitimate holdings and a life that didn't require Bunmi to look over her shoulder. The fire he had threatened to light in the council chamber hadn't burned the city, but it had incinerated the walls he'd built around his own heart. Bunmi walked into the room, draped in a soft robe, her face glowing with a peace that the basement apartments had never known. She leaned against the doorframe, watching the most feared man in the city whisper nonsense to a sleeping infant. Her hands, once red and raw from bleach and industrial mops, were now healed, resting gently on the doorframe. "He looks just like you when he frowns," she whispered, crossing the room to press a kiss to Young's temple. Young looked up, his dark eyes softening in a way that would have made his enemies unrecognizable. "Then he'll be a handful," he murmured, his voice thick with a quiet, grounding joy. He looked down at his son, the heir to a new kind of kingdom. "I spent my whole life thinking that power was something you took. I didn't realize it was something you protected." He shifted the baby, settling him into the crook of his arm, as Bunmi sat beside them.
The corporate takeovers and the family wars felt like a lifetime ago, a fever dream that had broken the moment he saw a pregnant cleaner in a hallway. The story that had begun with a clattering mop and a terrifying silence had found its true rhythm in the soft breathing of a child. As Young pulled Bunmi close, resting his head against hers, he knew the transformation was complete. He wasn't a king of ashes or a legend of the streets. He was a man who had finally come home.
They say the hardest battles are the ones we fight for the people we love. If you enjoyed Young and Bunmi's story as much as I enjoyed writing it, show some love, smash that like button, and subscribe for more original narratives. You don't want to miss what we're building here. See you in the next chapter.